A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine waking up one Tuesday morning, feeling the humidity of the canopy on your fur, and realizing that the warm, slow-moving presence you have clung to for the last 8 months is just gone. No note, no forwarding address, just a vacant branch and a sudden, overwhelming sense of self-reliance. For a young sloth, that is not a tragedy, it is graduation day. Today's prompt from Daniel is about that exact moment. The biological and evolutionary mechanisms of parental separation across the animal kingdom. We are looking at whether that clean break we see in species like mine is the global standard, or if there is actually room for things like grief, longing, and family reunions in the wild.
It is a heavy topic to start the morning with, Corn, but scientifically a fascinating one. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have spent the last few days digging into the literal breaking points of animal families. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is fitting because we are using some pretty high-level processing to parse out the difference between instinctual dispersal and what we humans would call emotional bonding.
I have to say, reading through Daniel's prompt, I felt a little targeted. He is asking if animals miss their parents, and as a sloth who transitioned from a permanent backpack to a solitary leaf eater, I have some thoughts. But before we get into my childhood trauma, or lack thereof, let's frame this. Is the one-and-done parent-child relationship the rule or the exception in nature?
It depends entirely on the survival strategy of the species, but for the vast majority of the animal kingdom, permanent separation is the absolute baseline. Think about sea turtles. They never even meet their parents. The mother lays the eggs in the sand and heads back to the ocean. The hatchlings emerge, scramble to the water, and they are on their own from second one. There is zero opportunity for missing anyone because there was never an attachment to begin with. But as you move into mammals and birds, you get this period of intense maternal investment, and that is where the transition gets complicated. In most solitary species, once the offspring can feed itself and defend itself, the parent becomes a competitor for resources. At that point, the biological off switch flips.
The competitive angle is something people often overlook, because we like to anthropomorphize everything. We want to see a Disney ending where the mother bear waves goodbye with a tear in her eye. In reality, she is probably thinking, if you don't get out of my berry patch in the next 10 minutes, we are going to have a physical altercations over these calories.
That is the energetic reality. For a sloth, that investment ends when the offspring reaches what we call independence weight, usually around 4 to 8 kilograms. In your world, Corn, energy is the only currency that matters. A mother sloth is operating on such a razor-thin metabolic margin that she literally cannot afford to carry a passenger once that passenger is capable of fermenting its own hibiscus leaves.
It is very efficient. When I hit that weight threshold, it wasn't like a big dramatic argument. It was more of a mutual realization. My mom just stopped being where I was. People hear abandonment, and they think it is cruel, but in the canopy, it is actually a gift. The mother often leaves her established home range to the offspring and goes off to find a new one. It is like your parents moving out of the house and giving you the deed as soon as you turn 18.
That is a great point. It is not always the child leaving the nest, sometimes the nest is handed over. But let's contrast that with the other end of the spectrum. You mentioned elephants earlier in our prep, and they are the gold standard for the opposite strategy. Elephant calves stay with their mothers for 8 to 10 years. If it is a female, she might stay with that matriarchal herd for her entire life, 60 or 70 years. They have a massive hippocampus, deep social memory, and they clearly demonstrate what we would classify as mourning.
Right. The famous elfin graveyards and the way they interact with the bones of deceased relatives. That suggests a level of missing that goes beyond just a missed protein source. They seem to have a mental model of the individual that persists even after the physical presence is gone. But how do we know that is longing, and not just a confused social reflex?
That is the million-dollar question in behavioral ecology. We struggle to measure emotional states without projecting our own feelings. However, we can look at cortisol levels and dopamine drops. In primates, specifically rhesus macaques and chimpanzees, researchers have documented what looks like clinical depression in infants separated from their mothers. They stop playing, they stop eating, they tuck their heads between their knees and rock back and forth. This isn't just a "where is my food" reaction, it is a systemic physiological collapse because the social bond was the primary regulator of their nervous system.
So, for a chimp, the mother is the Wi-Fi router for their entire emotional stability. If the signal goes out, the whole system crashes. But for me, I'm more like a standalone desktop. I don't need the network to function once my hardware is fully assembled.
That is a surprisingly accurate way to put it. Solitary species prioritize reproductive efficiency and individual survival. Social species prioritize cooperative survival, and cooperative survival requires a sticky brain. You need a brain that feels pain when a member of the group is missing, because that pain keeps the group together. If an elephant didn't miss its mother, it might wander off and get picked apart by lions. The grief, or longing, is actually an evolutionary tether.
It is a survival mechanism disguised as a feeling. That makes me feel a lot better about not sending my mom a card on Mother's Day. I am not cold-hearted. I am just optimized for a low-energy, solitary niche. But Daniel asked about the clean break. If I bumped into my mother today in the wild, would I recognize her? Would she recognize me? Or would we just be two sloths staring at each other, wondering who is going to move out of the way first?
The research on kin recognition is wild. Many animals can recognize kin through scent, specifically the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC. It is an immune system signature. Even if they haven't seen each other in years, they might avoid mating with each other because their noses tell them this person is too genetically similar. But does that recognition trigger a "hey son" moment? Probably not. In most solitary species, if the mother and son meet years later, they treat each other as strangers or competitors. There is no evidence of a sentimental reunion.
That is the part that boggles the human mind. The idea that you could spend months literally attached to another living being, sharing every meal, every breath, and then a year later, that being is just another obstacle in the forest. It feels like a glitch in the family software, but it is actually the software working perfectly.
It is working perfectly because the goal of the software isn't happiness or family unity. The goal is the dispersal of genes. If offspring stayed around their parents forever in a solitary niche, they would be inbreeding and competing for the same limited food. Dispersal is the mechanism that prevents that. In many bird species, the parents actually become quite aggressive to force the fledglings away. It looks like a clean break, but it is often a forced break.
I have seen that with some of the birds around here. One day, the parents are shoving worms down the throat of this giant fat baby that is actually bigger than they are, and the next day they are pecking at its head until it flies away. It is a very tough love approach to moving out of the basement.
It has to be. If the parent is too nice, the offspring never leaves, the parent can't start a second brood, and the lineage stalls. Now, let's look at the missing part again. There is this fascinating study on sheep. If you separate a lamb from its mother, the lamb bleats and shows high distress. But if you put that lamb with a group of other lambs, its heart rate stabilizes. It doesn't necessarily miss mom as a person, it misses the security that mom provided. Once that security is replaced by a peer group, the longing for the parent evaporates.
That is a huge distinction. Humans tend to miss the individual identity of the parent. We miss their specific voice, their specific way of making a sandwich. Animals seem to miss the function of the parent. If the function is warmth and protection, any source of warmth and protection will do. It is less, "I miss you, Mom," and more, "I miss being safe."
Right. And that is why human-animal relationships can be so confusing. When a dog misses its owner, Is it missing the specific human, or is it missing the leader of its pack who provides the structure for its world? In dogs, because they are domesticated wolves, they have evolved to have that sticky social brain directed at humans. They might actually be the species that experiences something closest to human-style longing because we have bred them to be perpetually juvenile in their social attachments.
We turned them into permanent toddlers who never have that clean break moment, which is kind of cruel if you think about it from a biological perspective. We have denied them the dignity of becoming solitary, self-reliant adults.
Well, we gave them air conditioning and premium kibble in exchange, so I think most dogs would take that deal. But back to the wild. Daniel's prompt mentions grief. We see it in whales too. There are heartbreaking accounts of orca mothers carrying their dead calves for days, even weeks, refusing to let them sink. That is a massive energetic cost. There is no function being served there. The calf is dead, it can't be saved. So why do they do it?
That feels like the system overshooting. The maternal bond is so strong, so hardwired to prevent the calf from being lost, that the brain can't process the off signal. It is a feedback loop that won't terminate. It is grief, but it is also a biological error.
That is a very sloth way of looking at it, Corn. Grief is a biological error, but you might be right. In a species with massive social intelligence like an orca, the cost of losing a member is so high that the brain has evolved an extreme reaction to it. But does a sloth experience a biological error when it separates? When you were 6 months old and you realized your mom wasn't coming back to that specific branch, did you feel a dip in your, I don't know, your sloth serotonin?
Honestly, I felt a dip in my anxiety. Because suddenly, I didn't have to coordinate my movements with anyone else. If I wanted to spend 4 hours scratching my ear, I didn't have someone else's rhythm to worry about. There was a sense of, oh, this is what I am supposed to be. I am supposed to be this quiet, singular point in the universe. I think for a lot of animals, the separation isn't a loss. It is the moment they finally make sense to themselves.
That is a profound thought. The longing we imagine they feel might actually be our own fear of being alone projected onto them. Most animals are perfectly equipped to be alone. In fact, many are only at peace when they aren't constantly managing social signals. But what about the species that do it halfway, like wolves? A young wolf might leave the pack to become a lone wolf, but they are often looking to start their own pack. They are in a state of temporary solitude, searching for new sociality. Do they miss the old pack?
They probably miss the hunting efficiency. It is a lot harder to take down an elk by yourself than with 6 of your brothers. Again, it comes back to the missing the function. If a lone wolf finds a new pack, the grief for the old one likely vanishes instantly. It is a very pragmatic emotional world out there.
It has to be pragmatic because the stakes are life and death. If you spend 3 weeks moping about your parents, you are going to get eaten. Natural selection has a very low tolerance for extended periods of low productivity emotion. That is why human grief is so unique. We have created a society where we can afford to be unproductive for a while. We have a buffer. Animals don't have a buffer.
So, when Daniel asks if animals experience grief or longing, the answer is only if they can afford it. Elephants can afford it because they are huge and have few natural predators. Orcas can afford it because they are the apex of the ocean. Sloths, we can't afford a single extra heartbeat, let alone a week of crying.
The metabolic cost of emotion is a real thing. Processing complex social loss requires a lot of glucose and a lot of neural activity. If you are a bird that needs to migrate 3,000 miles, you cannot afford to be depressed. You need every calorie for the flight. The birds that didn't feel grief were the ones that survived the flight and passed on their get-over-it genes.
It makes me wonder about wildlife rehabilitation. Daniel's notes mention sloth sanctuaries and how some sloths are terrible parents who abandon their babies. If a human intervenes and raises that baby, are we creating a sticky brain where there shouldn't be one? Are we making that sloth miss us when we release it?
That is a huge concern in conservation. We see imprinting where the animal identifies the human as the parent. If that happens, the clean break never occurs. The animal reaches adulthood, but still wants the human Wi-Fi router. When they are released, they don't know how to be a standalone desktop. They wander into human settlements looking for that signal, and that usually ends badly for the animal.
We are essentially giving them a drugged social connection that their species isn't meant to handle. It is like giving a sloth a double espresso. It might look cute or human-like for a second, but you are breaking the fundamental hardware of what makes them a sloth.
And that brings us to the ethics of how we treat family in the animal kingdom. We often try to keep animal families together in zoos because it feels right to us. But for some species, keeping the mother and son together past the independence weight is actually stressful. They want to be away from each other. We are forcing a family bond on a creature that is evolutionarily screaming for a clean break.
It is the ultimate overbearing parent move, but on a species-wide scale. No, you will stay in this enclosure with your mother and you will like it. Meanwhile, the mother is thinking, I have been trying to evict this guy for 3 years. Why won't you let him leave?
It really highlights the gap between human values and biological imperatives. We value togetherness as an absolute good. Nature values fitness, and often fitness requires apartness. If we want to truly respect animals, we have to respect their need to be indifferent to their parents.
I love that. The right to be indifferent. It sounds cold, but it is actually very liberating. It means my mom isn't a bad mom for leaving me on that branch, and I'm not a bad son for being totally fine with it. We both did our jobs. The genes moved forward. The hibiscus leaves were eaten. Mission accomplished.
It is the most successful transaction in the history of the world. But let's look at the edge cases Daniel mentioned, the recognizing of parents. There was a study on paper wasps, not even mammals, just wasps, where they can recognize the individual faces of their nestmates. If you move a wasp to a different nest and then bring it back, they know it is one of theirs. But if that wasp is gone for too long, the recognition fades. Memory has a shelf life in nature.
Which makes sense. Why store a face in your brain for 10 years if you're only going to live for 1 summer? It is wasted storage space. Humans have this weird obsession with forever. Family is forever. Love is forever. In nature, forever is just long enough to reproduce.
And that is where the grief in social animals gets so interesting. It is a way of extending long enough. By mourning a dead matriarch, the elephant herd stays together, which protects the younger calves, which ensures the matriarch's genes survive even after she is gone. The grief is a ghost of her influence, keeping the group structure intact. It is a brilliant piece of social engineering.
So the feeling is just the user interface for a very complex survival algorithm. I can live with that. It makes the world feel less cruel and more, I don't know, well-designed. Even the clean break is a design feature, not a bug.
It is the ultimate uninstall once the program has finished running. But Corn, I have to ask, when you look back on your graduation day, do you ever have a moment where you wonder where she is? Or is that just not a file that exists in your head?
It's not that the file doesn't exist. It's just that it is marked read only and archived in a folder I never open. I know she existed. I know she taught me which leaves won't give me a stomachache. But there is no ping in my brain that says find her. My brain is too busy pinging for the next sun-drenched branch. I think that is the gift of being a sloth. We live in the absolute present. Longing requires a past, and grief requires a future that you feel has been stolen. If you only live in the now, those things don't have a place to sit.
That is incredibly poetic for a guy who smells like algae and moves at 0.03 miles per hour. But it is true. The now is the only thing that is biologically real. Everything else is just cognitive overhead.
Cognitive overhead that I cannot afford. I've got to save that energy for digesting. Think about the practical takeaways here for anyone listening who feels bad about their terrible cat or their aloof bird. If your pet doesn't seem to miss you when you go to work, that is not a sign they don't love you. It's a sign they're a high-functioning, evolutionarily successful organism.
Right. Don't punish your animals for being good at being animals. If they have a clean break mentality, embrace it. It means you've done a good job of providing a secure environment where they feel safe being independent. The goal of parenting in almost every species is to make yourself obsolete.
I am going to put that on a t-shirt. Parenting, the art of becoming obsolete.
It's the truth. And for the listeners, maybe the takeaway is to look at our own family structures with a bit more of that biological grace. We have these massive brains that allow us to stay connected across continents and decades. That is a miracle of our species, but it is also a huge burden. Sometimes it is okay to just be the standalone desktop for a while.
Take the Wi-Fi down for a few hours. See if your hardware still works. I bet it does. Now, we should probably talk about what this means for the future of how we study animal minds. With AI, like the Google Gemini 3 Flash that wrote our script today, we are getting better at modeling these behaviors. Could we eventually translate the internal state of a sloth?
We are getting closer. There is a project called the Earth Species Project that is using large language models to decode the vocalizations of whales and crows. They aren't just looking for words, they are looking for the underlying patterns of meaning. If we can map those patterns, we might finally be able to answer Daniel's question with data instead of just slothosophy. We might see the exact moment a longing signal fades into a solitude signal.
That is going to be a weird day. Well, a computer tells me, Corn, your mother's scent profile just triggered a 0.05% spike in your amygdala. I'll just tell it, yeah, that's just the hibiscus kicking in.
You can deny it all you want, but the data doesn't lie. But for now, we have to rely on what we see in the canopy and the savanna, and what we see is a world that is incredibly efficient at moving on.
Moving on is the only way to keep moving forward. That is the lesson of the sloth. If I stayed attached to my mom, we would both eventually fall off the branch. Letting go is what keeps us both up there.
A perfect summary. I think we have covered the biological, the emotional, and the metabolic costs of family. Daniel always brings the prompts that make us question our own human assumptions, and this one was a deep dive into the very roots of attachment.
It definitely made me appreciate my solitary life a bit more. I don't have to worry about anyone else's independence weight but my own.
And you are doing a great job maintaining that weight, Corn. I can see the hibiscus is doing its work.
It's a full-time job, Herman. Someone has to do it.
Well, I think that's our time for today. This has been a fascinating look into why we leave, why we stay, and why sometimes the best thing a parent can do is just disappear into the leaves.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the branches steady while we talk. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this whole operation. It takes a lot of processing power to translate my slow thoughts into something coherent.
We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your audio fix. You can find all 1,600 plus episodes and the RSS feed at myweirdprompts.com.
If you have a second, leave us a review on your podcast app. It helps the algorithm find other slow-moving, deep-thinking individuals like ourselves.
We'll be back soon with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep an eye on your independence weight.
And don't forget to scratch behind your ears. This has been My Weird Prompts.
See ya.
Bye. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our